Reverend Bob Chase is recently retired, founding director of Intersections International, a permanent multi-faith initiative of the Marble Collegiate Church of New York. And prior to serving at Intersections, Bob was the director of communications for the United Church of Christ and was a principal architect of the God is Still Speaking campaign and comma. We all know those commas. He is an award-winning video producer. He has recently written a book called Beyond the Comma, and that applies to that iconic UC symbol of the comma to the life journey. So would you please now welcome Bob Chase.
Thank you so much. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. I am in the midst, my wife Blythe and I are in the midst of the California leg of our book tour. This is our last stop in Southern California. We head home tomorrow. We began this leg of our journey actually in New Hampshire, then went to Florida, and in New Hampshire it was 14 below wind chill when we were there. This is a little more pleasant. So we head back north. But we've had a great opportunity to meet wonderful people, experience gracious hospitality, warm friendship, and it's been a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited about being here as our last stop in California. When we came here last night, actually, the first thing that we noticed was we had to navigate some construction to find the place. Once we did that and came into the building, unique architecture, that's delightful. When you go to UCC churches around the country, you see such unique architecture from time to time. That was a pleasure. But we noticed all the posters from the God is Still Speaking campaign that are around the church. And that really warms my heart. We have the opportunity to encounter UCC congregations. And for the past 10 years, I've been in an interfaith ministry, so not related to the United Church of Christ. And people don't know my history with God is Still Speaking. But when we go and see the phrases and sing the songs and see the commas, it's really wonderful that now, 15 years later, more, people in the United Church of Christ are still being inspired by what we did back then. Even more significant was the warmth with which you greeted us. We used a phrase back then called extravagant welcome, and you all have really demonstrated that. Blythe and I both immediately said, wow, this is a friendly congregation. So in addition to your progressive witness in this community, you are friendly people. Extravagant welcome. Thank you so much. Will you pray with me? Oh Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I want to begin by assuring you that we will not deal with the Old Testament lesson today. That would take a long time. We'd be here till Tuesday, and the clock on the back of the wall would turn to a calendar. So we will focus instead on the gospel lesson. For in the story of the Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John had one of those intense, ecstatic experiences that might have transformed their lives then and there, except they didn't know what to do with it when it happened. Does that sound familiar? Confronted by the miraculous, they do not respond. How many times have we been in situations where we're confronted by something miraculous and just don't know what to do? According to the Lucan version, the disciples were weighed down with sleep. Have we ever been awakened from a deep sleep and looked around and been somewhat disoriented? The sleepy-headed Peter didn't really know what to do, and so he was practically babbling. He did not know what to say, the gospel writer says, and so he starts talking about building dwellings. Why? Was he reverting to the comfort of liturgy, a feast of the tabernacles? Was he trying to busy himself with lesser things so that he didn't have to deal with the extraordinary moment that was happening right in front of him? Was he trying to contain these visions, put them in a box, protect them from the elements, capture the moment in a medium that he could understand, symbolic bricks and mortar? Haven't we also undertaken these same avoidance techniques to escape things, even wonderful things, that we cannot fully comprehend? We are sure that he was, of course, only trying to be helpful, but as my friend and former colleague on the UCC's national staff, Reverend Kate Huey, reminds us, he was called back to faithfulness and perhaps to simplicity by the voice of God coming from out of the cloud to the terrified disciples, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." One might imagine God's annoyance that Peter didn't have the sense enough to remain silent at such a moment. But let's be honest, that whole experience up on the mountain must have been frightening for Peter and James and John. And when we're afraid, even in a good way, we often become tongue-tied, confused, and don't know how to react. Peter is very much like many of us because we often try to talk or reason our way into understanding, try to process an experience so that we can absorb its meaning and make the meaning part of who we are. That's not always possible, and perhaps even counterproductive to the experience God places before us. A former colleague from Intersections and a really, really good friend of mine, Fred Johnson, and I were in Kazakhstan for a conference called the World Forum of Spiritual Culture. 70 delegates from 24 countries gathered together to seek to find answers to global peace through spiritual, cultural relationships. On the final day of our stay in Kazakhstan, there is a beautiful mosque in Astana, the capital city where the conference was held, and we had a break in the schedule. So Fred and I visited the mosque, a huge facility actually, white and blue and gold, reminiscent to me of a great Wedgwood plate, clean and crisp. There was almost no one in the mosque, and Fred and I sat on the prayer rugs, and he asked me if he could pray for me. Fred is Muslim. He did, in Arabic. It was one of the holiest moments in my life, as this man from another faith and a vastly different life experience, and in a language I could not understand, offered thought to God about me. I have never asked him what he prayed. I don't need to know. The experience was not one you could explain rationally, but the experience was eternal. A couple years later, when I wrote my book, Beyond the Comma, where I applied the mark of punctuation, as Paul said, to the life journey, this particular story forms the concluding words of that book. The story of Fred and me in a mosque halfway around the world, so powerful, I would even say magical, that it formed the last thing I wanted to leave with my reader. It formed the concluding words in the chapter called Beyond Death. The Transfiguration reminds us that in the midst of teaching and healing, Jesus calls his followers to stop and pray, to be open to and strengthened by God's unexpected and indescribable grace, instructed by the voice of the still speaking God, and empowered to continue on the path towards Jerusalem. The final leg of this journey we ritually acknowledge beginning on Wednesday as we enter Lent. And we do well to simply heed the message that came from the cloud. This is my child, my chosen. Listen to him. But then Jesus and the disciples descend the mountain into the valley below. And in Mark's gospel, this passage is followed by important teachings that accompany the descent. Teachings about Elijah, about the power and limits of prayer, about the timing of his own death, about when to speak and when to remain silent, about belief and unbelief. But in Luke's gospel, there is a straight narrative thread between the experience on the mountaintop and what happens in the valley. Mark ultimately gets there, and they agree, but in Luke's gospel, it's direct. They encounter a crowd when they go down from that mountaintop, and a man whose son is demon-possessed and who calls out to Jesus, "I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Again, Kate Huey says, in his healing of the child, Jesus demonstrates that the mountaintop experience means God's voice was heard during the glorious episode up on the mountain, but God's power is dramatically revealed in what happens below, where people are suffering. And it's true then that in our own lives, thousands of years later, our experience of God, rather than being our own private pursuit of salvation, is inextricably linked to our response to the suffering of the world. That makes us vulnerable ourselves. Paradoxically, mysteriously, it seems that the closer we draw to God, the closer we draw to one another and one another's pain. But there's even more. This mirror image cannot be by accident. On the mountaintop, God says, "This is my child, my chosen." And then in the valley, the Father cries out, "He is my only child." Can we not see the relationship between the anguish in the man's voice and the poignancy in the words from the cloud about God's child, Jesus, resolutely moving toward Jerusalem and his impending death? Theologian Kimberly Miller Van Driel makes a poignant connection between the voice of God in the cloud and the emotion of the Father in the crowd. This voice was heard at Jesus' baptism, and it resonates again in the desperate plea of the Father, "I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." For several years, I was part of an annual event at Marble Collegiate Church called the Trialogue, created by the late Arthur Caliandro in the wake of 9/11, where an imam, a rabbi, and a minister preach on a Sunday morning from the marble pulpit and address a specific issue out of their respective faith traditions. One year, in the wake of Hurricane Sandy and then the horrific shootings in Newtown, Connecticut, we agreed to focus on the topic of inexplicable tragedy. What do our faith traditions say in such moments that can bring healing? Uncomfortable as I was about some of the religious language that emerged out of the shootings at Sandy Hook that followed the line, "God's little angels," I offered this instead. We have no rational answer to such things. And to try to fabricate a reason is almost obscenely arrogant and brings no comfort to grieving families. Instead, in the Christian narrative, God's own child, God's chosen, through no fault of his own, suffered humiliation, torture, and a painful death, so that God, the parent, understands our deepest pain. It is not rational, it cannot be answered by Peter's words or building silly dwellings. It is to be experienced on the mountaintop and in the valley. I experienced this personally in the first week of my tenure as senior pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Teaneck, New Jersey, many years ago. 5 days after I arrived, there was a multiple murder in the community. 4 children, ages 5 to 18, and the mother of the same family were all brutally murdered, shot to death in their home. The father, a Harlem tavern owner, was not home at the time and was the family's sole survivor. His family attended the church, and although they were not members, I ended up doing the funerals, even though I was only there for 5 days. From the moment I met him, I was convinced of his innocence. I later wrote a book with him, Wesley Diggs was his name, and about the way he had been immediately labeled as guilty by the police, by the news media, and even by his friends. We ultimately became the closest of friends. And to this day, the crime has not been solved, and he was never charged. The first time I met him, I told him, I have no explanation. There is no reason why this should have happened to your family. He later told me that my refusal to offer a cliched answer to his grief was very important to him, actually the first step in his healing. Sometimes mountaintop and valley experiences can occur simultaneously at a kind of intersection, what I call in my book, comma moments. On April 30th of this past year, my dad died. And in the midst of this incredible sadness, there was also joy. It was on our anniversary, the day he passed, and also my final day of working at intersections before retiring the very next day. So I was filled with emotion, but one of the emotions that accompanied the sadness was the fact that my dad and I had no unresolved issues. What a remarkable gift and what a tremendous joy. In fact, in the last few days of his life, my one regret had been that I never spoke to him directly. We'd talk around it, but never spoke to him directly about the fact that he was dying. And just a couple days beforehand, I had the opportunity to do just that. I reminded him of how when I was little, he used to read to me from a book called Uncle Wiggily. Those of you of a certain age may remember those books. And I read to him a brief segment from my book about a catch that he and I had had just a couple of years before. As we get ready to enter the season of Lent, it is interesting to note that in Luke's writing, 2 men appear miraculously 3 times. 3 times, that's significant. At the Transfiguration, to the women at the empty tomb on Easter Sunday, and to the men of Galilee on Ascension Day, in the first chapter of Acts. In the words spoken during these encounters, we discover valuable lessons, both for our mountaintop experiences and for the day-to-day tasks in the valleys of our lives that can be so all-consuming and so mind-numbing. It's important to note that there are comma moments not only in our individual lives, but in the world as well. The life of Jesus is one of those comma moments. 9/11 was a comma moment. I would argue that the election of Donald Trump is a comma moment. For that event plunged many people that I know well into despair, but also energized, and activated people of faith, especially women and people of color and queer people, to demonstrate, organize, and run for office, thereby applying God's command on the mountaintop. This is my son, listen to him, to the hard work that we do in the valley. Listen to him, for in his words lie the secrets of justice among peoples and the peace that passes all understanding. At the resurrection, the two men asked the women, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" And then they proclaim, "He is not here. He is risen." So be prepared not just to listen to Jesus, but to be surprised by God. Do not dwell on the things that make for death, but seek the way of Jesus Christ among the hustle and bustle in the valleys or at the intersections where the cross currents of difference reflect God's magnificent mosaic, and there you will find your Redeemer. And on the day of Ascension, they asked the men of Galilee, "Why do you stand here looking up?" In other words, look forward. Get on with it. It does us no good to stand rooted to the ground, gazing into the beyond. Rather, we need to look one another in the eye and move forward together across lines of difference so that the world can be a better place. And in so doing, we experience all that is eternal in the very present, the transcendent in the mundane, the mountaintop in the valley. May it be so for you this day and every day. Amen.
Thank you, Bob, for everything you've done, especially for the United Church of Christ and the comma which we all know and love. Our small group ministry here is even called comma groups. So at this point, help me, John, let's please